Thank you, Richard, so much for being here on the Makeup Historian. To kind of familiarize anyone who's listening for the first time, the goal of the show is to preserve the beauty and blemishes of history, which really is a more fancy way of saying it's a history podcast and anything goes. We're not going to shy away from any topic. But today I'm really excited to have Richard here to tell us more about his book and about also his being a Christian in academia. So before we get started with all of that, though, I want to give you a moment to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your academic background and how you kind of fell into the field of history.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to come on and talk with you.
Yeah.
It's been interesting I've been doing all these podcasts promoting the book, and there's so many people doing so many podcasts, and there's so many talented people out there that podcasts have really given a way to express their creativity. So thank you so much.
Of course.
Yeah. So my journey to academia, Sarah, was not a straight line. I was a horrible student in high school. In fact, when I was a sophomore in high school, I skipped 31 days of school, which you can't even do now, right? Because, it's like illegal to do it now, but I'm an old guy. And so I almost didn't graduate with all my friends. I had to take night classes. And I remember driving away from my high school graduation. And I tell people all the time that I finished high school in the top 30 of my graduating class. And there were 32 of us. So I finished in the top 30, pretty proud of that. But I remember driving away from graduation saying, I will never sit in another class again. And I went to work as an electrician. I worked for a couple of years, and I became a Christian when I was 16 and really began to sense a call into ministry, and kind of thought the thing you need to do is go to college. And so I went to Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee, and took a lot of hard work, but I managed to cram a 4-year degree into 8 years. And so once I was finally done with my 4-year degree in the 8th year, I said, okay, great. I'm done with school. And then worked in ministry and also worked in the secular world in sales. I actually have been a pharmaceutical sales rep for most of my career. And so I was in politics, and I ran a company. I was a CEO of a company for a while. And about the time all that happened, I told my wife, I really was sensing that God was calling me into the classroom. I'd been teaching in my church for a long time. And I said to my wife, I said, I think I need to get a PhD. And she said, well, go get it. And so I started a graduate program at Regent University, distance ed. Doing all my coursework online. A lot of people are doing that now. It's really come a long way. Ended up getting 2 master's degrees, one in the history of Christianity and the other in Christian theology. And got done with that, and slept late for about a week, and then applied to a PhD program, and working on a PhD from the University of Birmingham in England, in the UK. And so just working through that, and I still have a full-time job as a pharmaceutical rep, but I teach. I'm an adjunct for a local university, a local college here in Northeast Florida. It's a community college, has about 40,000 students, a very big school with several campuses. So I teach world religions to public college students. I usually teach 1 course per semester. And then there's a Christian college in New York State that I teach all of their upper level theology classes online.
Wow.
And so between those and trying to keep my kids on the right track and try to keep my wife happy and the dog fed, it's a pretty busy life, but yeah, so that's kind of the journey for me. And that's where I am. And honestly, Sarah, I don't mind telling you, and I say this a lot. One of my coworkers, he and I talk a lot, spend a lot of time on the phone. When you're, in sales, you drive a lot, and he's got a son that's kind of a pre-teenager, and they spend a lot of time at Boy Scouts. And my friend Brett has just fallen in love with Boy Scouts. But Brett was an Army Ranger, like he likes all that stuff. And so he and I talked about it. If he didn't volunteer with Boy Scouts, and I did not teach, then I would not have really any outlet for the thing that drives me, the thing that I really love the most. And so teaching has been really the primary expression of my divine call is teaching, both in a secular classroom and also teaching students who are preparing for ministry.
That is so incredible to hear. And thank you so much for sharing your story. Like I was mentioning to you earlier, one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you today was because I'm a Christian as well, an adjunct instructor. And in California, though, it's a little trickier given the politics in the state. So you were definitely an inspiration to me. And I think that's so cool that you're able to talk about your faith and find that professional, balance in life. It's very helpful. It's nice to hear and see. So thank you for that. But what I also wanted to do today, you have a book out now, Finding Washington. And that's what I wanted to dive in a little bit more today with our conversation, because from what I've read so far, you have a very fresh take on a lot of the historical discourse regarding Washington. Like you kind of even started your book something along the lines like, oh, another book about Washington, but it was so different. So I want to, maybe if you have some things in regards to kind of the highlights of his career that maybe a lot of people don't know about, but then also maybe some of those blemishes that maybe a lot of people don't know about either. That's what I kind of want to discuss with you a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. So yeah, there's, I think it's 900 or something books that are in print about the life of George Washington. I think it's either 700 or 900. It's been a minute. I wrote it during COVID. And I just got it published. So I sat on it for, a year before I decided to get it published. So I had to reread the book to see what I said about Washington. That's how long it had been. But so Washington is a very interesting character. And when I was growing up, going to public school, we would use the phrase father of our nation. And I don't think I ever really understood what that meant until I started diving into George Washington, the man, and the extent of the influence that he had over the other founding fathers and the person that he was. And even though I consider myself, even though I'm a church historian, I teach history of Christianity intersects with world history and American history significantly. And so I'm kind of on the fringes over here of being not a full-on American historian, but close enough that I think I've learned a lot. And so one of the most, when you talk about beauty and blemishes, one of the most beautiful things about George Washington was it was an undeniable reality to the founding fathers and for a few generations after Washington died. It was an undeniable reality for them that when it came to highlighting a person that exemplified American values and virtue, that George Washington was at the top of the list for 100 years in this country. And there was not even a real close second. George Washington really stood at the forefront of that. And so my take on this book, my take on George Washington, there's a lot of history done about George Washington, telling about his life and his military career and all of these things. But Sarah, what my approach to this book is, I am not happy with where we are in America culturally. I think that we are, by almost any standard historically, when I say historically, I mean through the history of the world, we are immoral, violent, over-sexualized, and I'm not happy with the generation. I'm not happy, quite frankly, with the world that I am handing my kids. I think that my generation, and maybe even my dad's generation, we squandered a lot of opportunity to be a light to other nations in the way that we had in the past. Not that we're perfect, right? The Trail of Tears still exist. Japanese internment camps still exist. I'm not saying that we're a perfect nation, but I'm saying that we have been, we've had a moral high ground for a long time until recently. So the question that I wanted to ask myself was, how can we inspire a generation to value virtue in a way that we have in the past? And to whom can we look to really extol those virtues? And my research took me to George Washington, and what I discovered was that from childhood, really, and I mean that from childhood, having good morals and virtue was important to him. He wrote a book when he was a kid about virtue and morality. It was Washington's Rules for Virtue. He wrote a book. He copied a lot from other people, but it was essentially his list of virtues. And I also discovered that Washington's faith was very important to him. I think that the prevailing wisdom among secular historians is that Washington was a deist. And I think the reason that is a prevailing philosophy is because it has to be true if we're gonna support the notion that America is not the fabric of who America is not based in the Christian faith or in Christian ethics. So you have to prove that the founding fathers had no real serious relationship with Christianity. Well, that's not the truth, particularly as Washington is concerned. We've all seen the famous painting of George Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge next to his horse. And I just assumed it was just a representation of what we felt like was Washington's faith. Sarah, that's not the case. That painting is a pictorial representation of an actual event. There was a Quaker who was on the side of England, who was riding his horse through the woods. He records it in his diary that he heard a man talking. As he got closer to the noise, he could tell that a man was praying, and according to this Quaker, he could tell that whomever this was calling to the God of the armies. And so this Quaker rides his horse up on this man, sees a man kneeling in the snow next to his horse, holding his hat, calling out to God, praying for the revolution and praying for the troops and praying for the cause. And turns out the man was George Washington. And it was this event that caused this Quaker to switch his allegiances from the crown to supporting the revolution, because Quakers generally supported the crown during the Revolutionary War. And so even though Washington didn't talk about his faith a lot, he certainly was not a deist. And just to remind your audience what a deist is someone that, generally speaking, thinks that God created the universe and essentially is just eating popcorn and watching the show and has no real interaction. Well, we know that's not true from George Washington's perspective, because the word that he used to describe God over and over and over was providence. That's the word that Washington used. He appealed to providence. And I don't probably have to explain to your listeners that providence does not describe a God that is removed and is just observing. Providence is a word that you use to describe a God that is involved in the matters of human history. And so Washington believed strongly in providence. He believed strongly in good morals and virtue. And throughout the course of his life, he was a model to the colonists. He was a model to Americans. And I highlight several virtues. So what I do in the book is I tell stories from Washington's life. And then I highlight virtues that he displayed in those moments. And then I make an argument for how we can revive those virtues in our culture. And some of the virtues that I identify are failure. What do we do with people that failed? Washington failed, and he learned from it. And how can we apply that to choosing leaders for ourselves? He demonstrated integrity and character and conviction and inspiration and empathy and courage and all of these things. And so I would say that the beauty of George Washington is that George Washington had a very solid grasp of his Christian faith that he didn't talk about a lot, because he wasn't a man that talked about himself a lot. And he eschewed any sort of spotlight, even though he found himself in the spotlight a lot. But he had a very strong Christian faith that fed a very solid set of virtues that guided him and guided our nation. And I would say that if I had to sum up the beauty of George Washington, Sarah, that's how I would sum it up.
Yeah, I love that. And also something you mentioned earlier, part of why you even felt compelled to really dive into this research, kind of what you're noticing with the generations right now and kind of this forgetfulness of American values. I 100% agree with you that that's a major issue. Where I notice it the most in my courses is the lack of knowledge about the Constitution. As an instructor, have you noticed that as well? Or is this more so a California thing? I don't know, but it's alarming to me.
No, Sarah. Now, I don't teach history. I teach history of Christianity, but I don't teach American history. I do teach world religions.
Oh, true.
I would say, generally speaking, Sarah, it has been my experience, because I do overlap a little bit with that. Because if you're talking about world religions, then you're inevitably going to be discussing geopolitics to some extent, right? You can't talk about Hinduism without talking about India, right? That sort of thing. And so when we talk about Judaism in my world religions class, inevitably we talk about Nazism, and we talk about the Holocaust, and I show pictures from the Holocaust and talk about that. And every semester, Sarah, and I don't plan for it, but every single semester, we get into a discussion about what it meant to be a Nazi. And one of the most surprising things that I find with students, because the popular thing to be is a socialist. That's like the popular thing to be if you're a college student.
Yeah.
Without any real knowledge of, number one, what that really is, and number two, how that has just failed everywhere it's been tried, right? And so when you look at these college students and tell them that Nazi is really an acronym for National Socialism, and Hitler was a socialist, it just, wait a minute, I thought Republicans were the socialists or the Nazis. Like, well, I mean, if you're looking at it from just a purely political perspective, Nazism is on the left, right? You can be a fascist and be either one. But anyway, and so I don't encounter that with the Constitution as much. But I bet you a nickel that if you were to go to Target tonight and ask 100 people if they'd read the Constitution, you'd probably get 100 people to tell you no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think maybe that's because I focus more so on American history. That's where I'm noticing kind of the same overlap with this lack of knowledge about American values, because I see it so clearly embedded within the Constitution, because we're not just a democracy. We're a beautiful blend of a republic and a democracy. We're a federal republic. So our values are not only listed, but exemplified really through the structure of the Constitution. And that's something that's super alarming to me. And I haven't quite yet figured out how to tackle that yet in the beginning of my teaching career. But you were mentioning kind of that overlap with history about Nazis. So, and that made me think of another book. I'm not sure if you've read it, but there's, it's by Timothy Snyder. He's a really well-known World War II historian. It's called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And he talks a lot about, kind of those warning signs, if you will, almost using history as an instruction manual, but he also talks about values too. So have you ever had a chance to read that one?
No, I'm not familiar with that, but maybe when the show's over, you can send me that information, because I'm always looking for good books, for sure.
Of course. And I know you mentioned you're working on your PhD, so I know you have a lot of reading to do. That book is a really quick read. And even the audiobook is nice to listen to, but it's something, given your research and from what I've read of your book so far, that I think you would really enjoy. Is there anything else about the book that is a little bit, unique in regards to your approach to talking about George Washington?
Yeah, I think so. So it's interesting. There are a couple of different responses to Washington. So, for instance, the book launched in June, the first week of June or so. And so I started running some ads on social media, just Twitter and Facebook. And, Twitter's a place you go when you're really angry about everything. That seems to be the general consensus of Twitter. And the comedian Ricky Gervais said Twitter's so funny because if you post It's like if you put, you staple a poster to a light pole saying, free guitar lessons. Twitter is someone saying, I don't want guitar lessons, you idiot. So it's like, so Twitter is just this place where everybody's mad. So I put these advertisements on Twitter. I got 2 responses, generally speaking. One response was, yes, Washington is awesome. And the other response was, Washington owned slaves. I had one lady send me a private message and said she could tell by the title of the book that it should be burned. That's what, and I'm like, well, maybe it should be burned because it's not good, but it certainly shouldn't be burned because the information in it is not correct. And so one of the things I wanted to do in the book, and I knew from the beginning, is that at some point I was going to have to talk about Washington being a slave owner. And so I think there are typically 2 different responses to Washington in terms of him being a slave owner. So the first response comes from Washington apologists. These are people that say, well, he didn't really treat his slaves all that badly. Or they say, he freed his slaves in his will. Well, first of all, he didn't. He said that when he died in his will, when Martha dies, the slaves can be free. So essentially, when we're done with them, they can be free, right? So Washington apologists will say that, he was good to his slaves. Well, Sarah, this is kind of crude, but we don't give a rapist a lesser sentence because he told his victim he loved her, right? So I don't really buy the argument that Washington should be forgiven because he was good to his slaves. The other side of the argument is Washington owned slaves, so there's not one single thing he ever did that was good, and let's tear down every statue. Right? Those are the 2 extremes. So I tackle slavery in the book, and the title of the chapter is Baby in Bathwater. So the argument that I make, and to me this is the blemish, if we're talking about beauty and blemishes, the blemish on Washington is that Washington owned slaves. The reality that Washington was a slave owner means that he failed his own set of virtues. He failed certainly his slaves, and he failed future Americans by not taking a position to finish addressing it the way he wanted to. So we're able to see over Washington's life, we're able to see him change on the issue of slavery. Goes from being a slave owner where slavery is just a part of the economy. And let me just say, if I say slavery and the only thing that you think of is the North Atlantic slave trade, then you have no real concept of slavery, which is an institution that has existed since humans were able to figure out that you could enslave other people, right? Mm-hmm. And I would also say this. If you think we should tear down statues of Madison and Jefferson and Washington because they owned slaves, then if you ever purchase another item from China, you're a hypocrite. Right? So if you're a male and you're watching this podcast and you view internet pornography, then you are doing more to support modern slavery than Washington ever did to support the North Atlantic slave trade, right? So let's just make sure that we're fair, right? Let's just make sure we're fair. So Washington went from slaves are necessary, a necessary part of the economy, to slavery needs to be abolished. So Washington and Lafayette worked on a plan to abolish slavery, whereby they were going to purchase land in the West Indies, send Washington slaves to West Indies to sharecrop the land so that they could be free and they could earn money on their own. The plan didn't work out. He wasn't able to get it done before he died. One of the things Washington did do before he died was he stopped buying and selling. It was really Lafayette that convinced Washington of the evil. Maybe John Adams some, because John Adams was really the only founding father that didn't own slaves, unless you count his son, John Quincy Adams. But Lafayette was really instrumental in helping Washington understand that you can't buy and sell humans. You can't do that anymore. That's contrary to both your Christian faith and your values. So Washington stopped buying and selling humans. Which meant that as slaves would get married on his property and they would have children, that he would have to, care for all these families. It almost ruined him financially. And again, I'm not saying that he gets absolved from being a slave owner, but I do say that you can see movement. And one of the things that I point out is that the question we really have to answer is, do we discount all the great things Washington did because he was a slave owner? Mm. And the position that I take is no. And the reason I take the position of no is because that's not how you do history, Sarah. You don't judge, and this is a broad statement, right? This is not to say that you can't judge the Nazis for what they did to the Jews and the Gypsies and the Christians, right, and the disabled people. But what I am saying is that you don't look back on history and judge them the same way you would judge those people today. You have to look at history differently. And you have to look at the context of the environment where people would do things. You can say that in almost any culture, in any environment, that the Holocaust was wrong because that was such an aberration to what humans normally do. But slavery is not. Slavery was something that's existed. And one of the things I point to that I think really highlights how complicated the issue was towards the end of his military career. There was a slave, I believe she was in New York. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley. She was a former slave. Phyllis Wheatley composed this beautiful poem about George Washington, thanking God for George Washington and asking God to place his hand of protection upon George Washington. And so what you have a former slave that is thanking God for a current slave owner. And I think that what's interesting about that is even slaves didn't define George Washington by that singular issue. So I think it's possible, Sarah, to say George Washington was a man of the highest moral standards and virtues, and he displayed it time and time again. And it's also possible to say that he failed his family, he failed his slaves, and he failed his nation by not doing something about slavery, especially when he knew it was wrong. And so I think both of those things can be true, and that's really my position on that issue. But that's certainly the blemish, in my opinion, on George Washington.
I would agree. And I'm happy that you took the time to really explain that, because this is something that I reiterate in my own classes as well. When we are studying history, we are studying previously lived experiences. Real life is messy, it's complicated, and our founders were real people. They're not perfect. They had their own shortcomings, if you will, and made mistakes. But like you were saying, it doesn't discredit the amazing accomplishments and what they gave to establish our country. So it's hard because I think in today's world of instant gratification, people want to compartmentalize. They want a nice kind of cookie cutter answer for these really difficult questions. And then when they go to scholars, we can't always give them that nice, polished response that they want, especially in regards to history, because it's messy sometimes and it is complicated. But I'm happy that you said that. Now, this is a little bit off topic, so if you don't want to answer a question about this, I totally understand. But as you were talking, I was curious to get your feedback on the push for CRT right now, because and I'm not too sure if this comes up as much in your field, but in regards to history departments and everything, it is like we talk about it all the time. But I've noticed that there is quite a disagreement among scholars about it. Some think it's kind of like the lens, a lens that we can view history through. But then now some scholars are arguing that CRT is a legitimate theory. And I'm kind of curious on your feedback on that.
So I live in one of the last free states. I live in Florida. So, you live over there in the People's Republic of California. So You're doing the best you can, right? So I don't have to deal with it as much, but I do have an opinion on it. And so So as a historian, as a church historian,
Mm-hmm.
right? The thing that I have to do as a church historian, and this is where I'll answer the question, is I obviously have a bias. So there's two different issues at stake when it comes to understanding history or perceiving historical events. There's bias and there's objectivity. So I am a Protestant evangelical, was raised in a Pentecostal, if you know what that is. I was raised in a Pentecostal environment. So a Protestant evangelical, I have a Protestant evangelical perspective of Christianity. So I have an inherent bias towards the history of Christianity based on my faith tradition and how other faith traditions may interact with my traditions. I have a bias. That does not mean that I can't be objective, right? The problem is not being biased. The problem is being self-deceived about your ability to be objective. And I think that critical theory, whether it's critical race theory or any other theory, I think critical theory is a dangerous lens to view through, because you're doing exactly what you and I are telling people you shouldn't do, which is view history through a particular lens. So what I should do is I should view history based on the events of history. I should just be able to tell the story.
Yeah.
I should be able to tell the story about history as a historian and let the story stand. But what critical theory says is you can't just tell the story. You have to tell the story through a certain lens. So if I'm teaching a bunch of fifth graders about George Washington, I can't say he's the father of our nation unless I say he's the father of our nation and he was a white man that oppressed black people and he helped put together the Constitutional Convention, which further, which further enslaved black people, right? That's not how you tell historical stories. You don't tell them through those unobjective lenses, because that bleeds bias into a lack of objectivity. And so I think that's what critical race theory does. And so it's okay if I'm a college professor and I view history through the lens of critical theory, right? Because I've done the work, I'm a scholar, and I can view it through those lenses, right? And I can tell my students, this is how I view it, right? That's kind of what you expect in college. That's just kind of the expectation. But what I don't like about critical theory is when they say, this is how you have to teach it. What's happening, Sarah, and I say this a lot, and I want you to stick with me here for just a minute, because we're a little off topic, but I just want you to stick with me.
Of course.
So for decades, good people have been willing to make public concessions for peace. Because when the people that hate this country get riled up, they demand concessions from peaceful people. And generally speaking, what peaceful people have been willing to do since the 50s and 60s, particularly the 60s and forward, is make small concessions, because if you just give them that, they'll leave us alone. Well, what they didn't realize is that a little bit is never enough for these people. They want it all. They don't just want to have competing views and be heard. They want to erase any other view. Mm-hmm. Now, if that's not tyranny, I don't know what is. So we've reached a point, Sarah, where good people are pushing back because we don't have any more concessions to give. Because now what you're telling us is, now we want your speech. Now you have to give us the words that you're going to say. Here are the words that you can say, and those are the only words you can say. We had someone testify before Congress the other day that said that one of the congressmen, because of the questions the congressman was asking, he was promoting violence, just the questions. And so what they're saying to us now is you give us your speech. And I don't think that good people are willing to give that up anymore. And so now good people are pushing back. And the other side is not accustomed to pushing back. They're accustomed to concessions, and they don't know what to do with themselves. So now they're getting angry. And so I'm sure you've studied the conditions of our country before the Civil War, Sarah. And in
Yeah.
my opinion, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope that when I say this, you tell me I'm wrong. But I believe that we're more divided today than we were at the beginning of the Civil War. The difference is we're not divided over one issue. We're divided over many. And we're not divided along state lines. We're divided ideologically, which makes it much more difficult to address. And so I think that the harder this minority pushes to push critical race theory or, sexual identity, curriculum and things like that, I think the harder they push, I just don't know where this ends, Sarah. And so this is the thing that keeps me up at night. So I wrote a book about Washington and how to restore virtue, hoping, Sarah, that Americans will read it and say, you know what, we need to be more virtuous before there's some all-out armed conflict over ideology. That's really my biggest fear.
Yeah, and I wish I could say that I disagree with you. I remember reading that in your book, what I've read so far, and it broke my heart to read that because I do agree with you. And I think a lot of it has to do with foreign powers, getting involved in American life, being accustomed now to instant gratification via digital technology. And I hadn't really quite thought about it, but the more I did think about it, like, are we more divided than we were before the Civil War? That's when I was like, I think he's right. And that really makes me sad. So, but on the flip side of that makes me super happy that you wrote the book, because I think this is something Americans desperately need. I think we are very much so kind of having an identity crisis, if you will, which is a little bit ironic because we're in the age of identity politics on steroids,
right.
But
for sure.
But yeah, so I wish I could disagree with you, but unfortunately I don't. And I think this is why it's so important for scholars, especially, to defend freedom of speech and to, self-publish if necessary, if they're kind of maybe trapped like I am sometimes being a scholar in California. I think the more that I kind of fight for my own freedom of speech in California colleges, I constantly go back to reviewing things from our founding fathers. And something that gives me a little bit of peace is they self-published all the time. They didn't wait around for someone to give them the green light.
Common Sense was wholly self-published by Thomas Paine, right? And listen, Washington used common sense to keep his troops in the fight. They were naked and eating flour cakes on ashes, and he said, "We've got to do something differently." So he got Thomas Paine up in front of him. He read, "These are the times that try men's souls," and man, it revived the revolution, and we went on to win it. So I had to self-publish Washington. I couldn't find anyone to take it on, because Washington, just saying the name George Washington, and I don't have to tell you that the publishing industry, they're not, they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning before work. They don't have prayer time, at lunch in the publishing industry. And so to write a book about George Washington, who was a slave owner, but I'm doing fine. People are buying it, and I want more people to buy it. But I will tell you one thing, and this is because this subject is heavy, right? I mean, people tune in, they're like, man, I just need something to get my mind off the junk of the day. And then Richard and Sarah talk about, we're going to die, And so, but Washington said something at the Constitutional Convention when, you had big states versus little states, southern states versus northern states, to try to jockey for power, and they couldn't decide on some issues. And so Washington stands up as the president of the Constitutional Convention, and he says these words. This is my favorite quote from Washington, and it's my favorite quote in the book. It's in chapter 11, which is titled Hope. Washington says, "To please all is impossible, and to attempt it would be in vain. The only way, therefore, is to form such a government as will bear the scrutinizing eye of criticism," and here's where you and I come in, "and trust it to good sense and patriotism of the people to carry it into effect." Washington had hope in us. And he said that there are two things required to make sure that we don't drive this thing off the rails. Number one is good sense. So that means we need to make sure that we're not a bunch of functional idiots and we know what we're talking about. And the other is patriotism. Patriotism means you love this place. This place isn't perfect. This place isn't by any means the best all the time. But Sarah, in 1776, the way the world governed themselves was through sovereign kings and queens who ruled by divine right, who said, we have a divine right to rule these people however we want. In 1776, this band of some of the most intelligent people of the Enlightenment got together and said, you know what? We believe that we've been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Yeah.
Competing views. And we aren't the best all the time, but the form of government that we have and the society we've created, there's virtually nowhere in the world where you have a monarch that reigns as a sovereign anymore, because this experiment of federalism and republicanism set Europe and the world on fire. And the last thing I want to see is us lose that. And I think that we can get it back, because I think the biggest problem we have is a moral problem and not a political problem, because we've always fought politically, right? You look at some of the political cartoons through the ages, and man, there's some pretty rough speech out there against political opponents. But I want to see us return to virtue, and I want to see us begin to vote for integrity over political party. If you're in a position to hire people of integrity. When it's time to promote people into management, promote people in management that have integrity. Choose integrity first. Choose character first. Raise up kids to be empathetic and not so mean-spirited, right? I think that we have an opportunity to change our little corner of the world. And throughout the book, I give my email. Even if you haven't read the book yet, send me an email. It's richard@findingwashington.com. And really what I want to do, Sarah, is I want to create a conversation about virtue and about our country, and see if we can do what we can't rely on our leaders to do, and that's change things from the sort of the ground floor up.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think we can. I think Americans, we have this grit that's just, innate. And I think once we get pushed to that point, we have a way of kind of bouncing back. And so, yeah, no, I definitely think that there's hope to turn things around, because you're right. We've always fought politically since day one. But I would love to conclude our interview maybe with some words kind of hope or encouragement to Christian professors in California, and also Christian college students as well, because we're getting hit pretty hard in regards to kind of the censorship out here if you are, if you're a Christian in California. So do you have any words of encouragement or advice?
I do. So the first generation of Christians lived in a country where their religion was illegal. The only legal religion in the Roman Empire was the pantheon of gods, or Judaism, or if they allowed some people that they had conquered to keep their indigenous religion, or whatever it is. But Christianity was an illegal religion, and it was persecuted. Christians were fed to lions for being Christians. All of the disciples were martyred. Right, Peter was hung upside down. Paul was fed to the lions. It was Polycarp, who was a disciple of the disciple John. He was. There's a whole treatise in my shelf over here on the martyrdom of Polycarp. And I would say that if I could leave Christians with one thing in California, I would say that there are competing kingdoms. There's the kingdom of this world, and there's the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God operates by different principles. And the kingdom of God is not the same as the kingdom of this world. And if you're a Christian, then you are a member of the kingdom of God. And if you're in California and you're in that place, God has you in that place to affect culture with the gospel. Not to just be good people, and not to just raise your kids as Christians, but the gospel is the way forward. The gospel of Jesus is freedom from tyranny, from spiritual tyranny, and even from physical tyranny. And I would say that you really have two choices. It's either pack your stuff and move to a state where you can be a Christian, and I'm not saying don't do that, right? Especially if you have the freedom to do that. And the other choice is to find out what your role is in kingdom work in that area. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but you have to make a decision whether you're going to be obedient to God or obedient to man. And when man's laws prevent you from obedience to God, there really is no choice. And your call may be to be a martyr, not in the physical sense that you're going to be crucified or fed to lions, right? But the kingdom of God is the priority. But then you have to believe. Sarah, here's what we have to believe. Christianity started with one guy and 12 people, one of whom denied him, one of whom turned him in. So you have one guy and 11 people now, right? About 50 days after Jesus was crucified, a little over 50 days, that 11 people had become 120 people. And they met in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. You read that in Acts chapter 2. And then after that, it became 3,120 in one day. And now Christianity is the most practiced religion on the planet. So the principles of the gospel transformed the Roman Empire and transformed the world to the extent that there are more people that call themselves Christians on the planet now than any other religion. 1 billion more than the second place religion. And 1 billion is a big number. And so trust the principles of God's kingdom and trust the gospel and trust that we don't fight against flesh and blood, but we fight against principalities and powers. And our fight isn't against our neighbor that has a rainbow flag. That's not our fight. Our fight is against the satanic powers that would like to see our neighbor that flies a rainbow flag go to hell when they die. And so that's really the message I have. And I hope it doesn't sound like a bleak message, because it's not bleak, because the gospel is more powerful than anything anybody can say or do to this mortal body.
I completely agree. And thank you so much, Richard, for that. I really, honestly, it's going to be so helpful to the scholars. Not just in California, but scholars and college students that are facing a lot of censorship. It means the world. It really does. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with me about your amazing book, your background, and your faith. You are always welcome here. And I hope we get to have more discussions in the future.
Yeah, listen, you've got my number. Text me anytime. If I could just do one more plug, you can find the book on Amazon. You can find it on Barnes & Noble. It's Finding Washington. I hope this doesn't show up backwards on the screen. Finding Washington, Why America Needs to Rediscover the Virtues of her most essential founding father. Barnes & Noble or Amazon. Sarah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This means the world to me that you would have me on.